Hi, everybody. Welcome to Live at 5, the Goodman Theater's, well, it's almost a television program. That's what I like to say. I have to say at the beginning of this terrible pandemic, I had no idea that I'd be turning my home office into a television studio. But indeed, I have, as many of you have out there, when you get the opportunity to talk to people through Zoom or any other medium. I'm Robert Falls. I'm the artistic director of the Goodman Theater, and I want to welcome you to tonight's fantastic event, a conversation with one of my favorite artists, one of the most remarkable visionary artists working in the American theater today. And we've been very glad to have her as the Manilow resident director at the Goodman Theater for these past 25 years, where she's directed, I think, 17 productions over these years, including revivals, including adaptations, musicals, and Shakespeare productions. And before we bring Mary on, let's just have a little taste of one of her wonderful productions. Hi, Mary.
Hi, that's great to see that.
Oh, I felt I had to put that on because that just makes me so darn happy.
I'm glad it makes you happy.
Well, you know, if you remember, it came after very dark days that have kind of continued. It was in the aftermath of our election. Well, it was the election.
Yes.
And so this was about 9 months later, and just putting it on our stage, it's just such a glorious piece of musical theater, and I just want to thank you for one of the funniest and just terrific shows we've ever done.
We had a ride. It really features Alex Sanchez's choreography there, doesn't it?
Well, in a fantastic way. But, you know, what was it that drew, I mean, that is not considered one of the great classic musicals, even though it's a golden age musical. But what brought you specifically to this unique piece?
I think Bob Falls brought me specifically to this piece, didn't he?
I did.
I think maybe you suggested it, although it wasn't as though I didn't know it. And, you know, it's right up my alley in a way because it is a bit more obscure. Yeah. Everyone thinks it's on the town, which understandably they do. But it's wonderful town. It's much less frequently done. You know, and maybe it's a little more problematic or not quite as, you know, easy to see how to make it work and all of that. So it was super right up my alley.
Oh.
And it was beginning of my beautiful love affair with Bree Sudia, and I believe the city of Chicago's beautiful love affair with Bree Sudia, who was a non-equity actress when I cast her.
I know, she was remarkable, as they all were. You know, I do remember what it was, so I'm not trying to be naive on that. It's because another one of the great musicals that you did similarly was Candide, with the great Leonard Bernstein score. Which again was a problematic musical that you went in and you went back to Voltaire. So knowing how wonderful your work was on Bernstein, I remember thinking, boy, one of the three great albums my parents played over and over again were West Side Story, The Music Man, and oddly, Wonderful Town. So I think I said, why don't you look at this? I think you might like a story of two girls arriving in the city.
And I absolutely do. And being from Ohio, you know, I'm Midwestern myself. And yeah, all of that is absolutely true. Yeah.
If you were to direct a musical, like a kind of a classic, I won't use the word warhorse, but, you know, coming off of The Music Man, which was so beautiful last year, and A Guys and Dolls, is there another musical in the canon that you've even thought about directing? Or you're going to wait for somebody to come and ask you to do one?
You know, most of them have been prompts by artistic directors, and I was very happy for the experience to go into a form I hadn't done and learn, I feel like, from the great masters. Like, all of these are sort of masterpieces of their genre. I have done Guys and Dolls out at Oregon Shakespeare Festival. We almost brought it to Goodman, but then I think we decided to do something else or something like that.
Right.
But Honestly, like there was something I wanted to learn and to live in, and I've had the time of my life in them. But I do find, making up my own thing and adapting my own thing, a more complex
Yeah.
experience for me. Not to, I had the time of my life and I've learned so much, and I will certainly do them again. And I was advantaged, and even though Candide and Wonderful Town, Candide especially might be a bit of a problem musical, it was a really great gift to just learn from, like these impossibly great showmen, who originally worked on all of those musicals. Like just such showmen, like how to hold an audience for an evening, what to do next. All the sort of tricks and structural things and things that work that sort of shouldn't, that I found all of that like super interesting to work on. I really did.
Had you ever looked at the Bernstein Peter Pan? Because that would seem like a piece that might be right up your alley in terms of.
Yeah, actually, the Bernstein estate really likes us and really likes my productions. Really, really like both of them a lot. And after Candide, I was visiting the offices of the guy who's in charge of like musical rights for them, as sort of their musical dramaturg, really. And he said, I have something for you. And he disappeared and came back and kind of handed me with both hands this little CD, which was the Bernstein Peter Pan, and I became obsessive about it. He was asked to do incidental music for someone's production of the play, the Barry version of just the play of Peter Pan. And of course, instead of just doing incidental music, it was a friend of his. He wrote a ton of music, though not quite enough to make it a musical. And so for quite a while, we worked on the idea, we teased the idea of like developing that and trying to do it. The thing is, he writes it for like a 45-piece orchestra.
Uh-huh.
And, for incidental music and this fantastic Captain Hook song. And there's a song that people sing in concerts, Spring Will Come Again, I think it is, and another one about home that are so, I'm so obsessed with. I've never quite gotten as obsessed with the little score as I am with that. But it is problematic. And the estate volunteered, to work with me to flesh it out, to make it more of a musical. But I sort of wanted to do it in the small space.
Yeah.
And then I think they have feelings about doing it in that chambery way in terms of instrumentation. They're protective of how it was envisioned. And so, it never has happened, but that's not to say it couldn't. And in fact, you're kind of reminding me of that because I had set ideas and stuff.
I think I probably remember you mentioning it. And again, I think that one of the things that was so extraordinary now that we're just focusing on the two Bernstein musicals is I've seen both of them. And one of them is obviously clearly problematic because it had so many book writers and it was not a success. We're talking about Candide. And then Wonderful Town was a giant hit in its time, but it sort of lost traction. And I just thought that you just brought a complete full sensibility to both of them. Wonderful Town almost felt like a new, fresh approach in such a complete way that was not unlike Candide.
It was a kind of, my friend Bruce said, it is a kind of a Trump era musical. It's a kind of feminist little take, on trying to make it in the world and all in the big city. But, the estate was, part of the reason people don't do Wonderful Town is that there's been an idea that you have to have Rosalind Russell or equivalent to be in it. Like you have to have this major force. And in fact, they were quite distressed that I wasn't going after big major forces and stars. We made those lists and stuff, but I like an ensemble. I like an ensemble. And
yeah.
And so we held these auditions and, lo and behold, and, Bree Sudia, who plays her, Ruth, just has to carry that whole thing. And she did, Well,
it was a fantastic piece. And I just want to thank you for the work on musicals. I mean, I was brought up on them. You were not particularly brought up on them.
They were around, but it wasn't at the heart of my drive towards the theater, the way it is for an awful lot of people. The way in, it was not. Straight theater plays were.
What was the first? I mean, I know, and you've talked about before. Growing up. Again, we were talking a little bit about libraries a while ago, particularly in small Midwestern towns that you and I both grew up in, and what a haven they were. And obviously, discovering storytelling and discovering myth and poetry through reading, if not in the library, then the books that were in your home. But what was the first production you ever saw? At all? It could be professional, or it could be, what was it?
Well, I've told this story about 400,000 times, but I'll tell it again. And it's true.
I've known you for 25 years, and somehow I have missed this story.
Yeah. My parents were both professors, and my father was a Rhodes Scholar. So we went to England when I was 5 and 6. And we lived in London in a suburb called Hampstead Garden Suburb, and our house bordered on this woods with the extremely English name, the Little Woods. And I would play in those woods. It's sort of inconceivable to me now, but I was 5 and 6, but I would play there by myself after school every day. I had kind of a familiarity in names for all the trees and all this. What I didn't know is that every year they staged Midsummer Night's Dream in a clearing in that woods. And I came across a rehearsal, and they were literally rehearsing Ill Met by Moonlight, Proud Titania. And after the scene, she runs away with the changeling boy, or he does. The fairy retinue ran in these circles like 2 or 3 times. There's literally like a gramophone with a plug somewhere. And so the guy playing Oberon ran in a circle like 3 or 4 times, and then he just started laughing, and everyone started laughing. Everyone kind of fell on the lawn laughing. He said, "How many times do we go?" And there was no part of me that for one instant thought they're fairies. It's not that. It was adults playing. I'd never experienced that. My parents were not playful people. I don't think I've ever phrased it that way in my life, but now that I think about it, they kind of weren't. And they were a bit more nervous people than that, actually. And I just had not seen adults. The image of joy in it was so extraordinary. And we did go see the play. Well, actually, I then went and got my sister, and we tried to watch rehearsal, and the director chased us away. To this day, I can't believe it. But then we did go see the play, which I don't remember much of. And I know around the same time, I was taken to Cyrano de Bergerac in Hyde Park. And also around the same time, I went to the Christmas Panto, this British tradition. And it was Cinderella. And I do remember that there was one of the mean sisters, her ball gown suddenly lit up with Christmas lights. And I kind of stole that. Me and Mara, my costume designer, have used that trick like at least twice, and maybe even more than that. Like, it remains an indelible image to me, So it was those experiences. I was in England, so I know I was 5 and 6. My mother was what we used to be called a culture vulture, and she took me to everything. She loved museums and plays. And
it just caused me, and I swear I hadn't thought about this, that I kind of flashed like one of my earliest memories of being in the theater, which was a little pageant in this little teeny town, not unlike the pageants that take place in The Music Man. And it was sort of a celebration, I think it was, of 100 years of this town that I grew up in. Mm-hmm. And my father, who was a transplanted New Yorker living in this little town, was playing like a cowboy. And he had a moment on stage, and I was probably 6. And I remember him. He had this thing where he had to take out some tobacco from a little pouch and roll, a cigarette. Take the papers, put the thing, roll it, light the cigarette, and play a scene. Weirdly, he'd never acted a day in his life with the cigarette. And I was so struck by the realism of this moment that I'd never seen my father do something like this, and the details of almost hyper realism. And I realized, of course, in contrast to your glorious visionary career of visuals and fairies and running around, I've sort of spent my life looking on these weird details of people.
I was going to make the same observation, that we stuck with that original aesthetic primal scene.
I know. I just realized that. Isn't that amazing? Just this little human detail. Well, I want to talk about, I think today, what I'm really interested in talking about is just, you are principally known for your adaptations. And indeed, while we premiered, I think the first premiere was a play by Paula Vogel in 1993, The Baltimore Waltz. Yep. The second production was an adaptation of
The Notebooks of Leonardo da Vinci, correct?
Yes. Yeah. Which I think in many ways sort of defines your aesthetic right off the book, right off the bat. That sort of defines what it is you've been doing now for the next 25 plus years, wouldn't you think?
Yeah. I mean, except for the fact that it's nonfiction and sort of completely non-narrative and sort of discursive text. But yeah, it's highly visual. It of everything I've ever done, Leonardo will always remain up in the top 3. I'm sure you have your top peak experiences. And sometimes, like, whatever play I'm thinking of or working on, that's the one that I feel like is my favorite of all time. Like, you always fall in love with what you're doing. But Leonardo, for me, had a kind of originality. And it still does, actually, I think. And it was the first play that anyone took anywhere of mine. It went to the Lincoln Center Serious Fun Festival. And I remember going with my cast and Meredith Zinner. We got off the plane and went into town and had lunch. And then she said, "So where's Manhattan from here?" We were on like 81st Street. And, so we were just like off the prairie with like corn cobs in our back pocket, And and we've revived it a few times and it's gone around a few times and this and that. And it's always remained, Leonardo is always such a compelling figure for any artist and for any human being, I think.
Yeah.
And so it's a series of vignettes that sort of illustrate parts of the notebooks or kind of counter illustrate them, arranged in a way around a couple of sort of famous, very rare autobiographical incidents in the notebooks. Yeah, so it was floor to ceiling water file cabinets, and out of them came things like meadows or stairways or dioramas, or you can see Meredith's little red skirt up there, or any kind of any prop, any piece of string. It folded, it transformed itself. It was one of the great sets I've worked on too.
I think that a couple things that strike me about that is what you just said. I mean, we could talk for hours about just the word transformation, just about magic in the theater. And we're going to be talking a little bit more about design in just a few minutes. But this seems to be, as one of the earlier productions of adaptation, that the concept of a set as a box that does tricks or magic things has seemed a little bit like a consistent thing in your work over these years.
Because first of all, pre-production is almost my favorite phase of working in the theater. And that's when me and the creative team are dreaming. What is going to be the physical manifestation of this? And because of the way I work, which there's no script when we start, the set is a kind of, it makes the script as much as anything. And I asked Scott to provide me with a bunch of things that I didn't know how I would use. And then they ended up kind of being at hand for the most marvelous, they suggested things to me. I always want a set to be what I call an open field of play, but full of possibilities and sort of transformational. And, we had these, I think 16 or 24 very long, narrow, small drawers that we pulled out at one time. And by the time we pulled them all out, suddenly there was a cave in the, there was a sort of hole in the wall. And one of these two autobiographical passages I mentioned is Leonardo recalling as a small boy standing in front of the mouth of the cave and being unable to go forward or to go back. And we recalled that idea throughout the play 3 times. And suddenly we were at the end and there it was. And I said to Marianne, after you finish the passage, step into it.
Right.
And it was an image of his death, of his, finding knowledge ultimately only on the other side. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think there's some kind of kismet when the collaborative team, and there's no script initially. I make the play every night before I go in with the actors and try out things and get inspired and make more things and try them out and, That's how it goes, which is unique.
To say the least.
Experience for people. And so all these things like costume design and set design, all the contributors, they shape the script. Whereas like if you're going to do Hamlet, you kind of know the conditions of that story. And you have a lot of a million different ways you can do it. But what are we going to do for the bedroom scene? What are we going to do for the graveyard scene? Do we need a trap? What are we going to do? You know what it's demanding. But when the script doesn't exist and you're working from a text that's 5,000 pages long and the show ends up only being about 90 minutes long or 75 minutes long, like what ends up in there is a result of the personalities and impulses spoken and unspoken, of everyone around. It's kind of, I mean, cornily to say, it's a bit of a magic trick.
Well, you know what? It is a magic trick, and you've sort of opened the door to something I really want to discuss, and we're very lucky to have a couple of your collaborators with us, because that interplay between the creation of a text, be it something like Leonardo, or be it some of the other adapted texts, you know, famously the Odyssey and Metamorphosis and many, many others, I'm very interested in that process of chicken and egg and what comes first in terms of design, text, and then acting, getting actors in there in the collaboration. We have two wonderful collaborators, two of your most brilliant collaborators with us, and we're going to ask them to join us. Mara Blumenfeld, who's one of our great costume designers, and also Lisa Tejero, one of our finest actors. Hey, Lisa. Hey, Mara, how are you?
Good. Hi, Bob. Hi, guys.
I'm so happy you could join us.
Yes. Mara, will you say how many shows we've done together? And Lisa, too, if you know.
Well, Bob had asked me this earlier, and I had to go back and look at my resume. And we've done 23 unique shows. That's not including remounts or other iterations.
Mm-hmm.
And how many? But you've had the great opportunity. It's been one of, I think, signatures of Mary's career in a very fortunate way. It's not necessarily a signature. Is you've been able to come back to these texts and these productions many, many times, quite often, which is unique. But we'll come to that. So, Lisa, what about you? I mean, how many productions have you worked with over the years with Mary?
It was interesting when Adam first asked me about that, and I was like, I have to make a chart, and it was sort of. Because of the pieces that are built from the ground up, I've done 8 different productions, but 7 of those I've helped been in the room to develop, and then 28 different productions, and 11 of those productions have just been metamorphoses, which equate to about 4 years.
Yeah,
and 6 of those were at the Goodman.
Wow. I am sort of dumbfounded by that collaborative spirit. You know, I mean, let's just talk about that for a minute, Mary. I mean, clearly there has to be, what is it about working with people multiple times? You meet remarkable actors or artists that gives you, I mean, what is it about that basic sense of collaboration?
Well, you know, what I feel like I'm doing is quite a bit risky. It's risky for the theaters. It's risky for the artists, as the artists will tell you that are also on the call. And so I really like to have people in the room who've been through the process with me before on other shows. And I always call them, remember, Lisa, I call them the old goats. Because I read that like thoroughbred racehorses sometimes have a goat with them in the stable to keep them calm. And so I always said Lisa was one of my old goats, because they're like, you know, they go out with the other actors and say, calm down, you'll have a part, you'll have something to do, it'll all be done. Because on day one, there's no script. And, you know, and then there's a little bit the next day and a little bit the next day and a little bit the next. And, you know, it's very good to have people around you that have done it with you before. Although I will say, when I went off to OSF, which is the only theater outside of Chicago I have made a new piece at.
By the way, that's the Oregon Shakespeare Festival. Just to let people know.
Which is where Lisa is right now.
Yes. That I did Whitesnake there, and it was very successful process. And I made them hire Lisa. I mean, now they're hiring her all the time, and I can't get her. But you know, I introduced her to them, and I just have to have a few people that like. Trust me, I've just got so much going on. Like the pressure is extremely.
Yeah, and you put that on yourself, but it's like, you know, you make it sound a little, well, it is magical, but you make it sound like sort of there you are in the rehearsal room, and then suddenly it's like something happens and you go off and write. But clearly you've been living with these texts your whole life and thinking about them. So are they formulating constantly? Is your mind working multiple, or how much time is kind of often just going in your head where you may be thinking about this, you may not have created the dialogue, but I would think you must be kind of forming in your mind a structure to the work.
Yeah, I think that the lead time when you really start seriously thinking is about a year out, which coincidentally is about when it's scheduled for a season, right? I've never in my life done a show that written a show that didn't have an opening date already scheduled. Like the gauntlet is thrown down. Now we have to meet that date, and that date is not movable. So I am thinking or avoiding thinking, or I can tell it's going really good when I can't help myself from starting work on it, and like when we're working on it, and having like fabulous discussions with Mara and often Dan Osling, Todd Rosenthal, other designers I've worked with that that I have to kind of do a lot of talking, because sometimes the text is not apprehendable by them. It's not small enough. It's literally 3,000 or 5,000 pages long. And I don't know what parts I'm doing. They're episodic things
right.
or collections of tales, and I have to figure that out. But nobody, and I also want to make really clear, sorry to ramble, but I don't have the actors improvise and then write down what they say. It's the opposite. I write the night before. I'm a day ahead of them, not a day behind. Bring it in, they do it. I think it's good, or we fix it a little bit, and I get inspired for the next thing. However, I'm profoundly inspired by them as who they are as people and what they're good. So if someone can sing in the cast, there'll be a song. If someone can't sing in the cast, there's no song. If someone's acrobatic, there's acrobats. If someone's really funny, can do this funny trick, then I find a way. I'm sort of cutting the script to fit the actors and the circumstances of the time, like the political moment of the moment. And like the set design I'm already given, and I think Mara should talk a little bit about how.
Well, I wanted to get into that. I wanted to get into that again as I talk about chicken and egg on how Mara you do that. I mean, we talked about designing the box that often you and they're quite simple sometimes. I mean, they're tricky, they're elaborate, they're incredibly beautiful, but they're often spare. And then you have these extraordinarily luscious, beautiful, witty, textured costumes that come into this spare box. Mara, at what time do you come into, when you're working with Mary, what makes it a different collaboration than with other directors in terms of when you come into the process or how you begin to work with Mary?
Well, I think a lot of the time, and Mary, correct me if you disagree, but I think oftentimes Mary starts with the kind of germ of an idea of what the set is going to be, whether that's with Metamorphoses, the idea was to be in water. But one of my fondest memories was our research trip to Italy for the Galileo Galilei opera. And we were at some little cafe. We'd just been to a museum, and we were kind of debriefing. And Mary drew this. She's very famous for her napkin doodles. And I have many of them. Dan has many of them. And she drew this little drawing of like a stick figure and a big planet and some arches. And that's basically, when you see that iconic image from Galileo, that was really what the set ended up being. Of course, Dan took that and expanded upon it. But I think often the world, the play, the sandbox is what comes first. And then depending upon the piece that Mary's adapting, I always sort of break it down into like 3 categories. There's like, the principal characters. We know there's going to be King Shahryar and Scheherazade. We know that there's going to be an ensemble. But then the thing that is so unique about what Mary does, and this has been true not just on the adaptations, but even on something like Candide or Guys and Dolls, she doesn't necessarily assign all the individual roles that the ensemble is going to play. And so you're designing general ideas without not necessarily knowing yet which bodies they're going on. And that comes out of the rehearsal process. So you also, I know a lot of people think like, oh, that must be so scary. And to me, it's the part of it that's so exhilarating. And a big reason that we've done so many of our shows at the Goodman, aside from the fact that it is one of our artistic homes, and at Looking Glass, is that those are companies that are able to, from a production standpoint, support that process. And that's been a great gift for us.
Let's talk a little bit. I'm fascinated. You already laid it out, Mary, a little bit. And Lisa, perhaps you could speak to that. I mean, Mary already talked about, we're going to come back to all of this, but, Mary talked about the fact that there you are, you're in a room. You may not even know what character you're playing. Do you ever read what is that risk that you're taking, that you're jumping into? I'm sort of asking Lisa, what is it like working with Mary? Obviously, it's an unusual process. You're not sitting down to work on Hamlet. you're coming in, and a piece I'd love to use as a reference point. And let's just bring it up for a minute, just a photograph of a wonderful production, Mirror of the Invisible World, which was produced twice at the Goodman, once in our smaller studio space in the old theater, and then a second time on our large space. This is a remarkable photo. But what was this like, Lisa? Do you remember coming into rehearsal for this production the first day?
I do. And in fact, I think with all of Mary's show, it's like a beautiful bungee jump. You're not quite sure where you're going to land, but you trust everyone around you, and they're very ensemble based. Even though Mary is definitely the leader of that, you have to trust each other implicitly to allow it to work. Your body has to be strong and ready. Your mind has to be open, and your muse has to be close by.
Look at you, Lisa.
I love that shot of Lisa.
And Stacey Ann.
Yeah.
Do you do physical work? Are you doing exercises or physical work prior to? Actually, are you working it all at the same time? Are you sitting around a table? Are you moving around first and foremost? Are you singing? Is there a sort of process that you're using with an ensemble to make an ensemble?
Well, it comes in different ways. It depends on, a lot of times Mary will have an idea of something visual that needs to happen, and we'll take an hour aside, and you wear a lot of leggings and things that you can move in because you practice doing lifts and how bodies interact with each other. And then a lot of times as the scenes come in, you start to do runs. So it becomes very much like a boot camp in terms of getting stronger and pushing it further each time, because you're constantly working at it.
Bob, I do runs early and often, and part of it's because I don't have much material, so we just run what we have, and that gives me a running jump to the next day. And, I know that you've come and sat in at runs, I think, but I even work that way, like doing Music Man. I think you came in like 3 days in, and we had act 1 or something, you know what I mean, without the dances, but you know what I mean? Like, I think I run really often and fast. I say that I'm a horizontal director, meaning I go really fast through, really fast through, really fast through, and it deepens through repetition, as opposed to a vertical director who works in detail on this moment and won't proceed until they go to the next moment, and then that gets perfect, then they go to the next. I just hope it comes out in the wash, because I have a script to write, at the same time. And I think on the actors, it's both super freeing and also terrifying. But I think mostly they have fun. There's a couple personalities I've worked with in my life that I think did not enjoy that process. People who have to know, where should I be? There are actors that need to have those know-ins, and it's harder for them.
They're the only actors I work with, by the way. I only work with those kind of actors.
But you recently cast Chris Donahue, who is, I used to call him my most important collaborator, because I think I've done 17, 18, 25 different shows with him, So, yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna acknowledge this publicly for people. I have this terrible habit. I've got a pen in my hand, and I'm clicking it nervously. And I've been told by our brilliant producer, Ken Matt Martin, not to do that. And he's so right. And I threw it on the floor until the last minute. I had to make one note, and here it is. So I'm throwing it over my shoulder. And I promise, as long as I do these interviews with great artists like the three of you, I will never be clicking my pen again. Lisa, what is it again that makes Mary just sort of unique? I mean, obviously Mary is extraordinarily unique, but is it scary? What is the fear factor, and what is the sort of joy that comes out of that collaboration as an actor?
I think you have to be ready to let go of control. When we did Argonautica, I remember we opened with a show we had never done before, but Mary had come to us the night before. We hadn't had a rehearsal, so we're like, okay, the show is set, and it had been 3.5 hours or 4 hours, and we cut a 20-minute segment. And the night before we were to open, Mary came to all of us, which included the cast, the dressers, all the crew, all the designers, and this was at Looking Glass, and said, I think I cut the wrong piece.
I made a mistake. I cut the wrong scene.
But she trusted us to make the decision whether or not we could handle it. So it was up to us whether we would go forward with what we were comfortable with, or move towards what felt like the right thing for the play.
And Lisa, I will never forget, you were a leader in that moment. And you said, we need to think about not tomorrow the show we want to do for the critics, but the show we want to run.
Mm.
And that was very persuasive to people. And it was the right. I remember driving home from our opening night on Lakeshore Drive in a kind of ecstasy, because we'd had the courage. Like, I don't make big changes in previews. Like, the process is tough enough. I feel like most things work them out. That is by far the most I made a like right turn about something, and then I decided it was wrong. And that because I cut a song, I cut like a fun scene and kept a quite difficult, long, really beautiful, and it had something in it I loved and I've never done before. It had 3 overlapping dialogues that all made sense and timed out, but I just cut it. And it was Alan Gilmore also, who was so gracious, because it was a scene that featured him. Yeah. He was in a lot of it, but he was very, very gracious. He was like, absolutely.
Right, amazing. That's very
yeah.
It was scary, because we'd gotten a standing ovation that night, Lisa. Do you remember?
Yeah, people loved the show, but
but it was too long, and the mood was wrong. It was hard to start the second act after coming off that sad scene that I'd kept in. I just remember that so well.
To come back to the design for a minute, Mara, in terms, you talked about being in Italy working on the Galilei Philip Glass opera that Mary co-wrote and worked on with Phil Glass. I know that you've done other research. I mean, a research project I remember specifically was the gorgeous work you did in India on the Jungle Book, and there have been others. I don't know if you spent time in Scotland when you were working on Lucia, but how do you do these? Is this unusual that do you work with all of your design, let's say principally, say, lights, costumes, and set at the same time? I'd love to, Mara, what makes working with Mary a little bit unusual in terms of perhaps that research process of what you're doing and what you're bringing to her?
Yeah, well, for Scotland, actually for Lucia, Dan and Mary had a very kind of amazing celebrated trip, which is the stuff of legend. Ask Mary sometime about how she killed the car and stuff.
I wrecked a car. Yeah, sorry.
But no, I mean, and the trip to India was just an unbelievable experience. And I think in that case, I couldn't draw, like, I can't go, this exact thing that I saw is what made it into the design. But it was the cumulative experience of us as a team, Mary, me, Dan, TJ, Doug.
Oh, heck. Yeah.
And
our music director.
Literally, like, the sights and the smells and the fabrics and the colors and all of that just sort of seeps into you. Which is not to say that you can't do great, rigorous work as a designer when you don't have the privilege of doing that kind of travel. But those trips have been really instrumental in our, or even the times that we don't travel to research, but we've gone out to Mary's house in Maine, and we kind of do these retreats where we lock ourselves in her house for 4 days, and you're on an island, so you can't go anywhere. And all we do is talk about the play and eat. The eating is very important. I think the thing is, as Mary's already talked about the old goats, like the designers we're the old goats as well. And the shared history that we have of working together is, and you have your designers that are your regular go-tos, that there's that foundational relationship and trust that you develop that allows you to embark upon what can feel to the outside like a really scary process.
Yeah, I'd love to look at one more piece here, which is another collaboration that the three of you had called The White Snake. Could you tell us very briefly, Mary, what The White Snake is in terms of the text that you drew upon to make this play?
It's one of the 4 great narratives of China. Like, it's absolutely known narrative. It's not any kind of sacred or holy text. It's ubiquitous in advertising and everything else, like Journey to the West, actually, which I did at the Goodman. And it's a kind of, I always call it Romeo and Snakeulette. It's a little snake spirit comes down to Earth for a day, which is, I think the scene we'll see. She's going down with her companion to see what Earth is like. And then she falls for a mortal man. And she's in her sort of mortal disguise. So he doesn't know he's married to a snake. And eventually that involves a lot of complications.
Well, let's take a look at it.
Where shall we go? All of Earth lies before us. How shall we choose?
We might go anywhere. But once I overheard a woodcutter who had ventured up our mountain. I remember that he sang over and over, "In the sky we have heaven, and on earth we have Hangzhou."
In the sky we have heaven, and on earth we have Hangzhou.
The West Lake is in Hangzhou, with aisles and bridges, bamboo groves and gardens. Let's go there.
Whereabouts does it lie?
Oh, we'll know it when we see it. The lake is such a mirror up to heaven. We'll see our own reflection, even at this distance. We'll look as though we're lying in a field of blue roses.
There's no such thing.
Then forget-me-nots.
What a crazy little serpent you are.
Oh, no, madam. Remember, I'm your crazy little servant now.
Oh, that was just great. That was beautiful.
We were invited to China. We took that show to China at a theater festival, and we were kind of the hit of the festival, actually, although we had misadventures there. But
that's for the other hour-long sequel. We'll have
produced it. It was the Goodman that took we did that show in 7 different theaters, but it was the Goodman I wanted to take the lead in producing it in China. I felt,
we were able to do it.
Forever.
We were able to do it. Lisa, what do you remember about working on that production?
It was the first time, like Mary had said, that you had done it outside of Chicago. So it was very interesting. And OSF is Oregon Shakespeare Festival is also a very different matrix unto itself in terms of theater companies. But everyone was not really sure what they were getting into. And I think I was stage right cloud in that one. But it was.
Can I ask, what was this will come back a little bit later. What was your motivation psychologically playing stage left cloud?
Don't hurt the actors. Don't.
Okay. Very practical.
Yeah. And beautiful at the same time. So it's always sort of like, is it a happy cloud or is it a very angry cloud?
Well, you have to make those decisions or it wouldn't be authentic. What do you, Lisa, when you come back to these productions, and obviously you talked about, was it Metamorphosis that you've done all like 11 productions of?
Yeah.
I've heard Mary talk about, what it is coming back to these texts. What's it like as an actor in your life to be coming back and working on plays that you may have done 10 years ago or 5 years ago or 2 years? What changes for you? What do you find when you come back working on a play?
It's really interesting, particularly in Metamorphoses, where a lot of what I did was narrative. And I think when you're allowed to do that, every day you can be whoever you are in that moment. Whereas a lot of times when you are a character, you have a certain set of deliverables you have to meet. So you can't grow as much. Whereas with a lot of Mary's work, you can reflect what's happening in the world that day or buffer it. And Metamorphoses is a great example of that in terms of we were in New York, August 2011, and then opened shortly after September 11th. And Mary's great advice then was don't lean into that. Keep doing the show you're doing. But at the same time, know that that's going to affect your audience and yourself. Mm-hmm. And that happened with Whitesnake when we did it. We were in Berkeley and there was the Sandy Hook shooting and people were just shaken. And, some people were like, should we say something? And I was like, actually, we shouldn't. We should let them come into the room with whatever they need to, but also give them space to feel that. So Mary's work it's very specific, but it has a very open energy to it that it lives with your life wherever you are.
If I could say, so I don't feel embarrassed by all of this, it's actually the nature of the texts I'm doing. I feel like they're ancient and they address really serious things. They address eternal and I would say universal things. They're the great masterpieces of global literature, in my opinion, even though sometimes they're more obscure or not. But I think, they end up addressing, when something big happens, those classics are there for us because they've hung around so long because they're always relevant, because they're always addressing kind of fundamental human dilemmas We know we're going to die. We're going to lose things. We're going to love someone who maybe doesn't love us back. We feel that we're not seen for who we are. We don't know our place in the world. All those things are what are addressed in them. And it kind of, they're dressed in different costumes and may call God by a different name or something like that. But they're addressing, they're addressing really fundamental things. So they're just always seem to be at hand for those big moments. That's what they're built for.
Do you find that when you're coming back to a text, when you're coming back to a production, I guess two things. Obviously, I think you've just answered my question, that you have changed, the world has changed. So it's like the same way Hamlet, as a great text, holds that mirror up at that specific time. These texts do as well. Do you feel a sense sometimes when you come back to work, because you actually wrote it, that, somebody else wrote this? Does it become like a classic? It's like, oh my God, I'm so thrilled to be working on the Odyssey. It's such a great play. Yeah, do you know what I mean? Like there's a moment where there is this moment, you give birth to children. I myself have never done that, but I've seen people do it, where they're like this child and they're sort of seem unformed, and then they have to grow, and you teach and you're with, and they're experiencing. And then at some point they're just adults. They're on their own. Do you ever find that there's this experience of being separated a little bit as you're watching work?
Yeah. And I love coming back to old shows. To speak of the Odyssey, Chris Donahue and I first did it together at Northwestern when he was 22. And then we did it at OSF 3 years ago when he was 52. That's the span of time. And that was so moving and so deep for me.
Yeah,
and
I was going to say, Mary.
Go
ahead, Mara.
No,
go ahead.
As soon as you were talking about that, I have such a visceral memory of our first read through at OSF, and the moment that Christopher opened his mouth, and Odysseus doesn't show up for a while. We used to have bets during tech of how many days it would be before Odysseus would make it on stage. But in that read through, the moment that Christopher opened his mouth, I just burst into tears, because it was like this sense memory of when we first did it at the Goodman.
You touch back to who you were at that moment, and it all comes back in the most kinesthetic, bodily way. And it does for him too. It does for the actors. Their blocking comes back to them. In fact, I found it very, very hard. I try to make changes to scenes with the same old actors. I try to change something up. And maybe they can accomplish it in the rehearsal room, but the moment they're in front of the audience, this unconscious body memory takes over, and they do their old blocking, like they do the old way we used to do it, because they did it 1,000 times.
Yeah, it's amazing.
It is amazing.
Hey, I wanted to say, I did forget something right off at the top, that one of the wonderful things about these Live at 5 events is that we have a fair number of people, they tell me, watching, and I forgot to tell them that they have the opportunity to ask us questions, and that there's a way to do that by going to a chat box somewhere. And if people are interested, we've got a couple of more minutes, actually more than that. We're going to be here for at least 15 more minutes. If you have questions for Mary, just put them down there, and we'll try to answer them towards the end of this conversation. Listen, Mara, I want to thank you so much. I want to thank you, Lisa, so much for being with us and really sharing your time and talking about collaboration. And you've both been wonderful, and you're both really, I've said it before, remarkable artists. So it's been a thrill to have you at the Goodman and to have you here today. So thank you both so much.
Thanks, Bob. Thanks, Mary.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Now we get bigger.
Now we get just a little bigger. What is Sunset Boulevard? The actors didn't get bigger. We got bigger, or something like that. I'm terrible at
small, whatever it is. Yeah.
I'm terrible at movie quotes. I'm going to have to put my glasses on here because I can't. I try to avoid this big reflection, but I also can't read any questions when they're coming in. I have to tell you one thing, Mary. This is because I think we overlap with one single production we've ever directed. I don't think you've ever done Death of a Salesman, and I certainly have never done, Mirror to the Invisible World. Do you know what it is?
That we've both done something? Is it Music Man?
No, I think it's Measure for Measure, isn't it?
It's Measure for Measure. I have a huge experience with Measure for Measure. I was in it at school. I directed it at Shakespeare in the Park in New York, believe it or not.
I know. And then,
I loved your production. I loved coming to see it. I always go to productions of that. It's the Shakespeare play I know best. And it's very flexible in how it's done, and I'm always interested.
Oh, well, thank you. I asked you because I knew you would tell me how much you loved it, and I was feeling that at the moment that I knew. I wanted.
Any questions here?
Yeah, no. Here's the thing. I don't think I've told you this, but I've told other people this, and I think this just defines one of the things I just love about you and your work, and it's just so visionary and beautiful. And mine is really about people rolling cigarettes and smoking in great details. Epic cigarette rolling. I had tortured myself on Measure for Measure for the first moments of that piece because I couldn't figure out why the Duke, I mean, the first thing, many of you know that play and have seen it, but the first moment of the play is the Duke of Vienna leaves suddenly. He announces to everyone that he's leaving. It's a city filled with vice. It's falling apart, and he's turning it over to this Puritan Angelo, who's going to sort of bring order to the city, and he's out of there. And it's a very quick first scene in a way, and he's out of there. And I remember agonizing in my way over why is the Duke, why? What happened to him? What is the psychological scar and ghost that he's carrying in his background that makes him need to leave the city? And why would he turn it over to Angelo, who seems the least likely? I couldn't do, and I was literally for like a year working on the play, and I would work on it, and come back and go, I got to solve this problem. And I remember coming to you and saying, you directed this play. Why would this Duke leave the city of Vienna when they need him most? And you said, you looked at me and you went, well, Bob, if the Duke doesn't leave the city, the play can't begin.
Yeah, that is my approach to Shakespeare in particular. The actors say, now where am I coming from? And I've been known to say, the green room. I mean, I'm being a little bit sarcastic. Obviously I don't mean that exactly. But you learn from Shakespeare about plot and how you got to keep it moving.
That is all true. The language moves it around. You have to trust the language. But, I do my thing, which is I get in there and I start breaking apart and psychoanalyzing it for better or for worse. It just becomes my production.
I could do more of your approach. I mean, do you know
what I never talked to you about? I don't think. I did the last production I did before we shut down was a year earlier, and it was The Winter's Tale. Yes. And I struggled greatly with the second half of that play. And I almost came to you at one point and said, Mary, I really want to work on the first part, which is this horrifying psychological Strindbergian drama of a marriage. And then you would do Bohemia.
I think someday we should do that.
And the sheep would come in and the dancing maidens would come in and it would be completely, the statue comes alive. Yeah. However, what probably would have been most exciting if we switched and we just did those other things, you know what I mean? Yeah. Just to challenge us in a different way. But I always wanted to tell you that about working on Measure for Measure. Yes. And also another production that is one of my favorites. It was, I thought, a remarkable production of Pericles.
Yeah, I was going to say, you're reminding me of Pericles.
Which seemed like that was a project you could have collaborated with William Shakespeare in the room.
I'm just proud of it. Yeah, I love that show.
Yeah. Do you know what? We've got a few minutes, and I think there might be some questions. I hope so. And if we want to take a look here. We have the great Nambi Kelly. Mary, when you return to the text, how does your role as playwright shift in subsequent productions? Do you ever rewrite, even years later?
The thing I rewrote the most was Treasure Island recently. I rewrote like hell between the Looking Glass production and further, but typically, Nambi, I don't that much, and it's much more relaxed for me. My audition process, the rehearsal process, it's much more just standard and more easygoing, and it's a bit of a challenge. You can sense this, I'm sure, in directors that you're the second cast of or whatever. It's a bit laborious pretending that you don't have a strong idea how this should go with new cast members. That's, I'd say, is the most challenging thing, to not be like teaching it to them, but allowing it to both be theirs, but like get that laugh when you know you're supposed, and how to get that laugh, you know? I do rewrite a little. There are certain things, so I mean, there's one line in Metamorphoses I've rewritten 20 every time we do it. I've never gotten it right. But I think that's virtually unchanged from the first production. So some rewriting, in one case a huge amount, often not a lot, honestly.
Great question. Really wonderful question. Emily Werner is asking, what have you found helpful or resourceful to continue staying sane and supporting the arts during the COVID pandemic? That's a great question.
I don't know if I'm supporting the arts enough, except by like going to 4,000 Zoom meetings with my various affiliate theaters in school. But I will tell you something that I'm secretly like super tickled by, Bob and everyone. I'm learning how to draw, and I'm taking it super seriously, and I work on it 3-4 hours a day, and it's super meditative and satisfying, and it's something I've wanted to do forever. Mara mentioned my stick figures. Like I've always been kind of expressive, but I've never had a minute's formal instruction. And I've had my both costume designer and my set designer, I've asked to teach me to draw, and everyone who can draw says it's a trick. It's a trick. I'll teach you the tricks, but I never had time. And it has saved my life, because it's really hard thinking about a show because the show might not ever happen. And that's really hard, especially for me who doesn't write in a vacuum. Like there's always a date, right? And there's just kind of nothing. We're like stuck in an airport. We don't know when that flight's taking off, you know? And so I guess I'm feeling kind of creative doing it. And it's very satisfying because you can see progress. You actually make progress pretty quick.
Wow.
From zero to something.
I find that's inspirational and quite moving. My glasses aren't working.
It says, can you please say something about the end you wrote in Jungle Book where the soul of the deer comes to meet the soul of Shere Khan? Yes, I'm very interested in transcendence and even transubstantiation and redemption. And so I didn't want Shere Khan to just die as the villainous tiger. I gave him this line, I never liked being a tiger. He died. And then he kind of gets to transcend. He kind of gets to go on to something better. I seek that out in all the texts I do the world over. And, with some Indian thoughts of reincarnation as well in there as an inspiration. And I love the music in that moment. And Larry Yondo playing it, I just go for those. I want everyone to be redeemed,
Let's see another question here. Can you read that? Because my glasses are malfunctioning.
Would you consider adapting a George MacDonald fairy story? I'm not sure I know who that is, unless, Douglas, is that like the green fairy book, the blue fairy book, the yellow? I had those when I was in England.
6 p.m.
I'm afraid that I don't know who George MacDonald is. I feel very ignorant. So I'm sure if it's a fairy story,
we'll look it up.
I would be interested.
We'll look it up. We'll put it top of the reading list. We have time for one more question. So let's see if we have one more question.
Also, same fellow.
Wow.
Your adaptation of Trojan Women available? I did not adapt that. What's unique about it, Douglas, is that it's not the typical. Oh gosh, what's his name? Euripides. It's not the typical one that's done. It's a Roman version. That's by Seneca, a very cynical, dark playwright. And I picked that version of Trojan Women largely because it was translated by David Slavitt, who did the translation of Metamorphoses that I used, and who, although I have never met him, I feel a soulmate to. And so you can just go do that. It's Seneca's Trojan Women, translated by David Slavitt. I also used his Roman version of the Argonautica as well as a Greek version when I did Argonautica with Looking Glass. I'm a huge fan of his adaptations. They're free and easy, playful. Jim, that's how many people I know. It's lovely to see and hear you all.
Well, it's lovely to see you, Jim Ortlieb. I'm so delighted that you were with us. And I think with that, It's a lovely way to go out. It was lovely to hear these questions. It was wonderful to hear from your associate artists that you've worked with. And after 25 years, it's still a tremendous joy and very moving to see your work at the Goodman.
Right back at you, and thank you for paying attention to me.
Oh my goodness. Well, it's been, you know, it's the great joy of my life. You know, I feel very fortunate to direct my own work, but the opportunity to have seen your work and Chuck Smith and Henry Godinas and Regina Taylor, and I could go on, I'm leaving people out, has been really, really moving to me. So I want to thank you, Mary. Thank you for spending time with us. We could do this for another hour easily, but instead we're going to play out with another favorite joyous production, which we've already talked about, and that is Candide. And I want to thank all of us for joining us. I hope we all see you the next time, I think in a couple of weeks, when Live at 5 comes back. Thank you, Mary, and thank you all of you who've spent the hour with us tonight.
Yes, thank you for coming and supporting us.